There are many cases where facilities originally intended to provide care and support have turned into places of darkness and suffering. In the capital of Russia there is such a place, a building designed to be one of the country's most prominent medical facilities, but transformed into a source of misery. Join us as we delve into the dark past of Hovrinskaya Hospital. When the doors leading from the street to the front office opened, the duty sergeant didn't bother to look up from his newspaper. The sensors above the entrance were so sensitive that they often responded to passing cars rather than people entering the building. He didn't lower the newspaper until he heard a faint cough to find an elderly woman standing there, looking at him cautiously. The officer asked her in a harsh tone about the reason for her presence at such a late hour, adding that for her sake, it must be important. She nervously replied that she had come seeking help, looking for a policeman to assist her in finding her lost dog. Without hiding his displeasure, the sergeant told her that all his officers were busy dealing with real crimes, and instead ordered her to seek help from her friends or family. The visitor replied without hesitation that she had no one else to turn to, and even if she did, she highly doubted they would accompany her to the nearby abandoned Hovrinskaya Hospital. At the mention of the abandoned building, the sergeant narrowed his eyes. He folded the newspaper and placed it on the desk, then leaned forward and replied that no one should enter that place under any circumstances. If her dog had strayed there, it was almost certainly dead, and the matter should end there. But the elderly visitor was not discouraged. She pleaded several more times in vain for help, and only left when she was finally threatened with arrest for wasting police time. He returned to his newspaper as the old woman exited through the doors to the street. The officer shook his head in frustration. The sooner the authorities demolished that place, the better, as it had only generated an endless series of unspeakable violent crimes for the local police. The desk sergeant didn't learn the fate of his unwelcome visitor until a week later. Despite his warnings, she had indeed gone to search for her lost pet alone, only to be discovered later in horrific and mysterious circumstances. After a historical struggle with inadequate healthcare services, authorities in Moscow approved the construction of a modern medical facility in the 1970s. It was decided that the new hospital for the capital would be located in the northern Hovrinskaya area of the city, near the Lika-Purka River. From the beginning, there were speculations among many project participants that its ambition might exceed the ability to execute it. The allocated budget was considered insufficient to complete a 10-story building designed to accommodate up to 1,300 patients. Additionally, a close examination of the designated construction area indicated that it was a wet site posing a significant risk of flooding and subsidence. However, the planners entrusted with the task were not deterred, and during the summer of 1980, the project's construction finally began. Neighbors and passers-by spent the following few months watching the giant hospital gradually rise from the ground. Built around a triangular star plan and designed using harsh brutalist architecture, the building looked as if it had come out of a science fiction or horror film. But after 2 years of hard work, with the building's exterior structure completed, work at the site suddenly came to an unexpected halt. In subsequent public meetings, questions were raised about how the funds allocated for construction work had already been spent. It then turned out that the site had previously been used as a city cemetery that had been closed and covered by the authorities in the late 1960s. This resulted in the constant flooding of the building's lower levels, causing large amounts of the budget to be spent on repairing them, ultimately leading to the project's bankruptcy. Despite repeated calls for additional funding, work at the site was never resumed, and it remained dormant for the next 36 years without being used to treat a single patient. On the contrary, it quickly acquired an unwanted legacy of death and misery for those who chose to walk beyond its perimeter. Although it was guarded against theft and vandalism during the early days of its abandonment, funding for security in the abandoned building soon ran out. As the number of explorers making their way through the deteriorating wire fence increased, calls to the local police inevitably increased. The building's internal structure was not fully completed, and as it deteriorated over time, more and more of those who ventured inside were subjected to misfortune or injury. As months turned into years, the bodies of drunks and homeless people who died while sheltering from the elements at the site were discovered and reported by others who trespassed there. There were also several cases where the bodies of murder victims were found dumped within the hospital grounds, leading to fears of a possible series of serial killings. Then in 1985, The community was shaken by the discovery of another body in the abandoned hospital, belonging to a well-known and beloved local retiree. The elderly lady in question owned a small dog that had escaped from her during a walk around the perimeter of the abandoned site. She summoned her courage to follow it, making her way to what would have been the reception area in the building. But she recoiled in disgust, finding it filled with the corpses and bones of many dogs and smaller animals. Some had been tied up and killed, while others appeared to have been torn apart or dissected after death. All this bloodshed seemed to have been committed by human hands. At this stage, aware of the dangers of wandering through the dilapidated building but still concerned about her lost pet, she turned to the local police. But when she arrived at the police station, the duty officer there dismissed her, saying they were too busy to help her and advised her not to return to the site. Sometime later, a group of boys who decided to explore the lower levels of the building found something floating in a large water-filled pit. It was the body of the elderly lady, which had clearly been lying there for some time before its discovery. But when local morgue staff were called to retrieve the victim's remains, they discovered horrific injuries to the woman's body. Her legs were broken and shattered, along with similar massive injuries to her back and lower torso, as if she had fallen from a great height. However, the room in which she was found was completely surrounded by the flooded basement perimeter, meaning it was impossible for her to have settled in the pit on her own. Moscow police found themselves in a similar perplexing situation in 2005, when they were asked to search the abandoned site for a missing person. They were contacted by the family of a 16-year-old boy named Alexei Krishkin, a popular boy known among his friends as Edge. Alexei had suffered from anxiety and depression throughout his life, and on this occasion, he had left his home leaving a suicide note in his room. After speaking with his friends, his family contacted the police to tell them that Alexei had been a regular visitor to the abandoned hospital and seemed fascinated by the site. Several officers were immediately dispatched to the building, and the initial search quickly found the missing teenager's personal belongings on the 8th floor, where his backpack was left next to a set of open elevator doors. It was naturally assumed that the young man's body would be lying at the bottom of the unfinished shaft. But when the officers made their way back to the ground floor, they were frustrated to find nothing but debris and rubble at the bottom. It took several more hours of searching before Alexei's remains were discovered lying in a side room on the 2nd floor of the hospital. Again, just like the elderly lady before him, he had suffered catastrophic injuries that appeared to have resulted from a severe fall. However, how his body had apparently been moved to a small enclosed room 2 floors up could not be explained with any degree of certainty. Despite police warnings, many of Alexei's friends later returned to the site after his funeral and held a private ceremony for him. A series of murals and paintings were completed in the room where he was found, but it soon became clear that this would not be his only legacy. Instead, there were multiple reports to the police from teenagers who were exploring the building and claimed to have been disturbed by a glowing entity. Its outward appearance was described as resembling a tall, thin male, and it was seen either in the vicinity of the elevator shaft on the 8th floor or in the room on the 2nd floor where Alexei was found. It seemed to be aware that it was being observed by those it encountered, and would immediately turn and move away from visitors, passing directly through solid walls and other obstacles in its path. It was said to disappear from sight as quickly as it appeared. Other stories circulating in the local community point to a trio of teenagers who were found murdered at the site sometime during 2006. There is also a story of an urban explorer whose twisted and broken body was found at the bottom of one of the empty elevator shafts in 2011. The exact number of people found dead in Hovrinskaya Hospital remains difficult to verify, as city authorities have repeatedly refused to disclose any official figures. They have also refused to comment on another frightening story commonly associated with the building's history, that relating to the activities of an evil group that became known over time as Namosta. It is believed that during the mid-1990s, this group of fortune-tellers adopted the empty structure as a base for their operations, and conducted demonic rituals in the rooms of the lower levels. When local residents began to link the strange and unknown nighttime activities of this group to the bodies found at the site, great pressure was put on the authorities to act. As a result, a police unit known as Oman was directed to solve the problem, and given the authority to use any means they deemed necessary to do so. The officers assigned to this task spent some time monitoring the abandoned building until they reached a point where they were convinced that the cult members had gathered. It is alleged that they then stormed the building, herding the cult members away into the lower levels of the basement where they were disposed of, and there they remain hidden beneath the floodwaters. Depending on where one might inquire within the surrounding area, different theories circulate about what happened inside the walls of the cursed Hovrinskaya Hospital. No one knows for certain whether the deaths that occurred there were the result of supernatural activities, or the dark acts of a human killer, but everyone seems to have an opinion. Some Moscow residents blamed the cult followers, claiming that the number of bodies discovered at the construction site decreased significantly once the police acted aggressively against the Nemosta cult. Others believe that the deaths were the work of a serial killer, or worse, a group of killers who may have been working together, either using the abandoned building as a place to commit their crimes, or as a place to display their horrific trophies to each other. Finally, for some, the fact that the land reallocated for construction was a former cemetery is perhaps the real reason for the horrors that occurred there, where the spirits of the dead rose from their graves, choosing to punish the living who trespassed on the property to destroy and desecrate their burial site. Unfortunately, the possibility of investigating any of the other deaths believed to have occurred there is now too late. After many years of reported tragedies at the abandoned facility, the site and everything on it was finally sold to a private company in 2018. In October of that year, the building's superstructure was finally demolished before being completely removed, erasing all traces of the hospital once and for all, along with its evil and mysterious past.